Welcome back to Telltale. We're going to do a topic video in this one on the question of why do we even like horror?
Big question.
Big question.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to just put it out there and
Go
ask it.
in there.
First of all, do you like horror and why do you like horror?
So I was not raised with horror like some people were.
Right.
I was raised in a fairly conservative Christian home. I went to a Christian school. I was homeschooled, before I went into public school eventually. And it was not something that my parents chose to expose us to. It was, I was kind of raised in the ideology that anything that gives the appearance of evil is probably bad.
Yeah.
So I held that value for a long time and just did not continue to not really expose myself to it until I got into high school and I started dabbling in it a little more because I started reading a lot of like gothic literature and the gothic
Hmm.
classics. I
Yeah.
really enjoyed those. And the darker they were, the deeper they felt to me and the more I enjoyed them. So now here I am in my 30s and I'm just starting to get into more and more horror
Yeah.
and finding that I do really enjoy it.
Hmm.
Um, and for a multitude of reasons.
Hmm.
The first one being, I find the philosophy of evil very interesting and
Okay.
very foreign to me.
Okay.
So analyzing that, I find and analyzing the human condition and asking the why questions and watching what, like, even though a lot of them are fiction, there's also a lot of true crime that's very horrific
Oh, yeah.
that I've read and I've experienced. And it's like, what gets a person to that point?
Hmm.
And at what point does the man become a monster?
Hmm.
At what point does the desperation cause you to have extreme behavior?
Yeah.
And I fully believe that everybody has that inner darkness.
Hmm.
Um, and the more desperate your situation or the more dire your situation, the more that can shine through,
Yeah.
potentially.
Yeah.
Um, So yeah, that's kind of why I like horror is because it makes me think very deeply outside of what I already think.
Hmm.
Because it's very foreign to me, but it poses a lot of questions, even to my own morality and like what would it take for me to get to that point where I had to murder somebody,
Yeah.
whether in self-defense or just because I hate them so much. Like what would have to happen to get me to that point?
Hmm.
And how did it happen to get someone like, I don't know, Dahmer
Hmm.
to get to that point, or
Hmm.
like in The Shining, watching that whole train wreck of a family with the ghosts and all those paranormal things, but the sense of desperation or even narcissism that
Hmm.
kind of gets that main character to the edge where he's basically just gone off the deep end.
Yeah.
So I like it a lot for the deep thinking and feeling that it causes me.
Hmm.
And I also like that it gives me like a sense of thrill, but in the context of safety.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I experience like Schadenfreude a lot, where it's like, I'm really glad I'm not that person. I'm glad I've never pissed off somebody that much. Or like, I'm glad I haven't violated the social contract in a manner that has caused this kind of situation to happen to me.
Hmm.
That kind of stuff. And I think it also gives me like a false sense of security sometimes too, where it's like, oh, well, if that ever happened, this is how I'd do it. Or it kind of gives me like a plan, so to speak, even though the likelihood of it happening,
Yeah.
you know, it's
Yeah.
it's unlikely, but still, like it kind of gives you that false sense of security. So
Hmm.
I think those are the reasons why I enjoy horror
Hmm.
and why I think a lot of other people do too. I think philosophically it's interesting. It kind of gives you that sense of security, whether
Hmm.
false or otherwise, that you
Hmm.
can experience a thrill or feel like you're prepared for something that may never happen or isn't
Right.
actually happening.
Right. The aspect of fear or thrill or putting putting people or putting yourself into a situation that is potentially deadly
Mm-hmm.
seems to be the common thread, but horror has so many different faces, so many
Mm-hmm.
different varieties of horror that I don't think one explanation covers it all.
No.
Because you take um, Well, you take the psychological horror of
Yeah.
Edgar Allan Poe,
Mm-hmm.
which is arguably where we started.
Mm-hmm.
That is more of an analysis of the human condition, an
Yes.
analysis of the human mind, an analysis of that dark side of humanity that
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned. And there's most of Edgar Allan Poe's stories don't have anything supernatural. They do have more of a psychological situation,
Mm-hmm.
like Telltale Heart. There
Mm-hmm.
isn't really any dead guy coming back to life.
No.
It's all in
It's the
the
paranoia.
protagonist's head,
Mm-hmm.
that and he drives himself mad from
Exactly.
his guilt. And
Mm-hmm.
that is the horror of that is the frailty of the guy's mind in this situation.
Yeah,
And
because of how wrecked with guilt he is.
yeah, and how, facing the evil that he did
Mm-hmm.
destroys him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the horrible part about it, that we could go through that.
Yeah.
We could go through something so traumatic that it sends us, into a
Mm-hmm.
black hole
Yeah.
inside of ourselves. So we do have that fear there of losing
Mm-hmm.
our minds, becoming insane.
Yeah.
Um, the next type of horror, arguably, is the supernatural ones.
Mm-hmm.
All your ghost stories, your cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft
Mm-hmm.
and William Hope Hodgson,
Mm-hmm.
and those are dealing with the idea that there may be things we don't understand, things we don't know about, things that come from outside of our comfort zone that could invade our lives and destroy us
Mm-hmm.
and kill us, put us in danger, take our loved ones away. And that's where the fear is there,
Mm-hmm.
is that those influences could be there and could destroy us.
Mm-hmm.
But personally, I find those I'm more fascinated with those kinds of stories for the imagination of the creatures.
Yes, I tend to be that way as well because I do like the creativity behind it.
Yeah, and it doesn't really give me any kind of fear
Mm-hmm.
because it is so over the top.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
it's so unreal,
It's a very
disconnected.
hypothetical what if,
Yeah,
so it feels very safe,
yeah.
all things considered. Mm-hmm.
And so then the next type of horror is the real horror of stories like Silence of the Lambs,
Mm-hmm.
or Dean Koontz's Intensity is a good example. Psycho,
Psycho, yeah.
where people around us could be evil and
Mm-hmm.
want to destroy us for some reason, or just try to destroy us for no reason
Mm-hmm.
other than that they have it in their
They
head
have
that
a
they want to
bloodlust.
do it. They have
Mm-hmm.
that evil inside them.
Yeah.
And that's the one I really find scary. But reading the stories, it's more about um, following the protagonist is usually a victim,
Mm-hmm.
and following that protagonist through their journey of fighting back
Yes.
and overcoming and beating
Yeah.
the serial killer.
Sense of hope, that really like
Yeah.
tiny speck of hope that contrasts so loudly against all the darkness you're seeing.
Yeah, the greatest
Mm-hmm.
part of Silence in the Lambs is at the end when they're in the dark. Sorry if you've never seen it.
Yeah.
When they're in the dark, and um Starling,
I can't remember.
I think Starling is her name. I know it's a bird.
Yeah.
Um, Agent Starling is down there and she's in the dark. She can't see a thing. She's got her gun out in front of her, but she's scared out of her mind because she knows this guy's down there.
Mm-hmm.
She knows he wants to kill him.
Mm-hmm.
And he makes a movement. She must have heard some little thing and she turns and kills him.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that the way that's edited, the way it's plotted, the way it's acted, the music and everything, the sound with it and everything goes together to really build the intensity of that. Your doubt in your mind, is she going to succeed or is she going to die here? Is he going
Yeah.
to get her? And then at the end she finally does succeed and
Mm-hmm.
overcome, and you're relieved, and it's following her journey
Mm-hmm.
through the whole movie, her journey of pursuing this guy and ultimately getting him and killing him.
And there,
That's what you like about it.
I think there's also absolute opposite. Like if your protagonist or the person you're rooting for dies in the end, sometimes I almost find it a relief that they died and don't have to suffer
Oh,
anymore.
yeah.
Like I think that's also a very real part of horror is like, oh, like you don't want anybody to have to die, but then you have to sit and think of the consequences of the trauma. And how is that going to impact them? And am I going to get a sequel out of it? Or is it just like sometimes it's like maybe it's better that they just die in the end because everything was so horrible and so awful. I
Hmm.
kind of felt that way about Critical Mass by C. Scott Davis when we
Okay.
read that one.
Yeah.
Where in the end, spoiler alert, Critical Mass, I mean, it does not have a happy ending, but everything that has happened was so horrific. I couldn't have imagined them having to survive that and have to live with what they experienced and having to like deal with the trauma of that. Yeah.
Shameless plug. I just got my copy. She's got the copy we read before.
Yes.
This is C. Scott Davis's Critical Mass. It's actually a collection
Hmm.
of his work and a number of others. Joel Byers,
It's a
Deneen
really great
Ansley,
collection.
R. Eric Smith, and Sue Bowers all went together and
Hmm.
did this collection. C. Scott Davis, I heard, passed on earlier this year, which is very sad
Yeah.
because I was really hoping to read some more excellent stories by
Yeah.
him. That one
This is a
blew me away.
fantastic indie collection. Like, love it. It's
But
so good.
like I say, I just bought this off Amazon. The book is still available,
Hmm.
brand new off Amazon. Go on there, look it up.
And
Critical
this is a
Mass.
nice variety of horror too. So,
Yeah,
shameless plug.
yeah.
But yeah, there are just some books and reviews that we've done and things that stories that we've read that like in the end you're kind of glad. Like Fall of the House of the Usher is another one
Mm-hmm,
where the trauma of just having to deal with that whole weird family incest situation
mm-hmm,
and the long suffering of Miss Usher was just so much
mm-hmm,
that you kind of hope that everybody dies at the end. Because, or everybody who has been suffering dies in the end.
mm-hmm,
Because the suffering has been so great, and you can't imagine them being a normal person and living a normal life
mm-hmm.
after the fact.
But then there's a rare type of horror story that is probably has its greatest expression in a work by Harlan Ellison, who wrote a lot of great stories.
Mhm.
It's titled I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. You've probably heard a lot about it. It is a great story, but it offers no hope.
Yes.
It does not end on a note of hope. It is
Hmm.
like, just abandon it, forget it.
Yep.
This is hell. It's over. You
Hmm.
know?
Yes.
Um, I don't know how many other stories there are like that that just end on such a sour,
Yeah.
hopeless note like that. But that is definitely a horror
I
story.
haven't read any in the horror genre, but I've read some dramas that have been kind of like
Well,
Wicked is
kind of
kind of like
is.
that.
Yeah.
Like with the book Wicked, not the musical.
Hmm.
It is very bleak.
Yeah.
The entire series is. It's like a literally just one unfortunate event after another in the
Hmm.
land of Oz.
Hmm.
And it just keeps going forever.
Yeah.
Um, but it
Oh,
is very
Sweeney Todd.
Oh yeah, Sweeney Todd.
Everybody dies in the end.
Everybody dies in the end, but they have to because justice needs to be served.
Yeah.
Because fuck those guys. Anyway, and sometimes too, you're just glad that the protagonist and the murderer both die.
Hmm.
Because you're just like, oh, thank God. He was evil and he was traumatized. There's just no way.
Hmm.
There's just no way.
Hmm.
And I don't know if I can say I enjoy that kind, but I do find a great sense of relief from those and a great sense of closure from those kinds of stories.
Yeah.
And that kind of it just hits different. So I don't know if like I don't know what to call that emotion.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Yeah.
Something like Titus Andronicus, where
Yes.
it ends with the
It's
feast.
just so tragic that you're just like
But is
Thank
it that's a
goodness.
case where everybody is despicable and
Yeah.
the world is done a favor.
Yes. And well, sometimes you feel that way though by the end of some of those some of the horror stories too, where
Hmm.
even the primary subject, even the protagonist is unforgivable or is not a good character or is very much an I don't know, an anti-hero in some manner,
Yeah.
where all the characters aren't even lovable,
Hmm.
where everybody's just so flawed
Hmm.
that you're just kind of like, I don't care what happens. Let them all die.
Hmm. And that's kind of a weird class because there's the question, why do we like seeing stories that are why do we like the tragedies? Why do we like Hamlet? Why do we like Macbeth
Mm-hmm.
when they do end with tragedy? Why do we like the Oedipus stories?
Mm. Which are horrific in their own different ways.
Hmm.
Yeah. Or like,
Probably we probably don't love the ending, but we like that the author gives us a slice of reality
mm-hmm.
that things don't always work out.
And I like feeling stuff. Like,
Hmm.
I like having big emotions and big emotional responses to things
Yeah.
because it reminds me that I am human.
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of ultimately what horror does,
Hmm.
is it kind of puts you as a person in your place.
Yeah.
And it humbles you and it reminds you that life is short and bad things can happen to good people
Hmm.
and not everything is fair and it's just that really stark sense of reality but in the confines of it's not happening to you. You're
Hmm.
just experiencing it vicariously through this work.
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of the appeal,
Yeah.
ultimately. But I mean, it's so different for everybody.
Yeah. And there are people who just can't conceive why anybody would like a horror story.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we're not going to sway anybody to go, oh, yeah, they're right. I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to happen from this video. But what I would have to say to those people is that horror and tragedy does, like you say, it causes us to reflect on the nature of evil. It causes us to reflect on ourselves. It causes us to reflect on the people around us, the world around us,
Mm-hmm.
and the meaning of it all
Yes.
through the tragic story,
Mm-hmm.
through the negative aspects of what's
Yeah.
going
And
on.
through
I,
the extremes.
I think it makes us to question our own selves, question our own world,
Mm-hmm.
and question our own values.
Yeah. And I think that's necessary too. I also think it's interesting. One of the things that my husband and I have talked about before is that certain political climates in certain places tend to affect how much horror is produced.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I'd love to see a psychiatrist chime in on that.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. So if anybody's a psychiatrist, do you know?
Yeah,
Do you know?
leave a comment.
Because it has been, and I've read some articles, but it's never by an expert, it's always by a critic.
Hmm.
I guess you could say they're still an expert, but still, it's a critic. It's not somebody psychologically analyzing this, but during more conservative politics, we tend to see more and better, better as a subjective term,
Yeah.
horror. So I find that very interesting.
Well, think of, at least in the movies, when were the biggest eras where you had horror movies? The first one was in the 1920s and early 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what happened in in the late 1920s? You had the stock market crash.
Mm-hmm.
1940s, you didn't see much horror.
Mm-hmm.
That was during a time you had Democrat in the White House, you had
Mm-hmm.
World War II, we were turning around from the Great Depression.
Mm-hmm.
You saw a lot of science fiction horror films in the
Mm-hmm.
1950s, but that was reactionary to the scientific horrors that were suddenly appearing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Major
the,
advancements post-war.
yeah, the next
Mm-hmm.
major surge of horror was in the 1980s with all the slasher films, 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you had mostly Republicans in the White House during those years.
Mm-hmm.
But you also did have a lot of stresses in the world,
Yeah.
um, oil shortages that were driving the price of gas way up, terrorist attacks
Mm-hmm.
on the Olympics and things like that
Yeah.
for the first time in our history.
Mm-hmm.
And you had a huge number of people get laid off as a
Mm-hmm.
result of foreign competition.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of U.S. industries weren't able to compete and were
Mm-hmm.
shutting down and laying people off. And so you had a huge amount of unemployment in the early 1980s and a big recession. But
Mm-hmm.
so, you do have it. It seems to come at these times when there are these big negative events.
Mm-hmm.
World War II could be said to be negative, but
Mm-hmm.
in the on the home front, everybody rallied around the cause.
Yeah. Yeah. There
And
was
so there's,
patriotism to back it up, and
yeah,
yeah,
you talk to somebody
sense of efficacy.
like the way my dad was. He grew up in the 1940s,
Mm-hmm.
and he just idolizes that period of time,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
because of the way people were rallied behind that cause so much.
Yeah.
So it really was a more positive time
Mm-hmm.
in the United States.
Mm-hmm. But just dealing with a lot of external factors outside of the United States that were scary.
Hmm.
And then like the Red Scare and the Cold War also, we got a lot of interesting things out of that.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that did it in the 1950s. And the revival of horror right now is probably due to the huge battles on the political front
Oh
that
yeah.
we see every day, that we are all fearful of somebody getting in there that's going to really muck things up.
Yep. Yep. And I think it's just a natural response too. When people are fearful, they try to express that sometimes creatively. And I think horror is an outlet in which a lot of creatives tend to turn to
Hmm.
as writers, as creatives, as filmmakers, cinema, all that kind of stuff.
Plus, it's like you say, we all do have that dark side, and
Mm-hmm.
and as creators, we do tap into that from time to time.
Yep.
Our ideas come from that side of us from time to time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what would scare us probably scares other people. Because for how
Yeah,
different humans are, we're all still so very much the same when you think about it. There is not a lot that that makes us different.
yeah,
So, well, without this video getting too long, that's all I have to say about that.
yeah. I think that covers it.
Yeah. So, why do you like horror? Mention some of the ones that you enjoy. We would love to hear your comments, questions, concerns, snide remarks.
And I did want to bring up that there are people who have gone much deeper into these subjects, like Stephen King
Yep.
in his book Danse Macabre, which I've just started reading, and
Hmm.
is a really interesting book.
Yeah. And there's interesting subjects too that you can talk about as well. The hierarchy of evil is a fascinating subject when it comes to true crime and what's considered especially heinous. So if you ever get a chance, give that a Google. If you're a horror lover or true crime lover, because it is a fascinating subject.
Hmm.
But yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.